Hi, and welcome to our second session of this afternoon of this Shrug Conference. My name is Jacob Doty, and I'll be the moderator for this session. We'd like to thank all of our sponsors for working with us and making this conference possible. In this session, we have Madeline Hart and Yesenia Escribano presenting on analyzing unenrolled agricultural lands and state water quality restoration plan areas. So with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Yesenia Escribano, and I'll be co-presenting with my team member, Maddie Hart. As part of FDACS Office of Agricultural Water Policy, the Water Policy and Planning section is a group out of Tallahassee that focuses on water supply, water quality, and regulatory issues that impact agriculture. Our group works cooperatively with DEP's BMAP and TMDL groups, water management districts, as well as other state, federal, and local partners. We use GIS on a constant basis to leverage reviews of technical documents, models, and projects, as well as provide data on agricultural production, acreage, and water use to our partners. We want to thank you for tuning into our presentation, and we will answer any questions that you have at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to type them into the chat as they come up.
All right. It is not moving to the next slide. This is exactly what happened the last time I tried to do this. Yesenia, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, all right. I don't know why, but now that worked. Sorry about that. So I'm going to go over a quick overview of our presentation. I will discuss a little bit of our background and mission for the Office of Agricultural Water Policy. I'll talk a little bit about water quality restoration plans in Florida and agriculture's responsibilities under these plans. Some difficulties that we encounter defining agriculture from a land use perspective. Then we will get into the meat of this presentation on the unenrolled agricultural characterization process. And we'll go over how we evaluate those results for our programs, planning and policy discussions. We'll go over some process and data challenges as well. This presentation will describe how the Office of Ag Water Policy within the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services examines unenrolled agricultural lands statewide at the parcel level to identify enrollable agricultural activity. And we'll talk about how this information is being used to monitor the program's progress and guide discussions relating to agriculture. The FDACS Office of Agricultural Water Policy interfaces with state, local, and federal agencies, as well as Florida's producers in matters relating to water policy that affect agriculture. So we enroll agricultural operations in our applicable best management practices or BMP manuals. We provide guidance and assistance to agricultural entities in meeting the requirements of enacted laws and policies throughout the state. We engage agricultural producers, stakeholders, and industry groups to solicit input and feedback regarding proposed laws, rules, and policies. We also conduct research for the improvement of existing BMPs, as well as developing new BMPs to better achieve environmental benefits while maintaining high levels of agricultural production. And FDACS ensures agricultural needs and measures to achieve load reductions are properly represented in water quality and water supply plans across the state. By statute, FDACS is a coordinating agency within the Basin Management Action Plan, or BMAP framework, that is handled at the top by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, or FDEP. We follow statutory directives to coordinate with other state agencies and the 5 water management districts regarding water policy and rules that affect agriculture. Refinement of what and where agricultural lands are in the state are critical for implementation of these best management action plans, or BMAPs. BMAPs identify the proper implementation of FDACS agricultural BMPs as a management strategy to address agricultural non-point source pollution. Any agricultural producer within a BMAP must do either of the two things listed on this slide, either enroll in the FDACS BMP program and properly implement the applicable BMPs for their operation, or they must conduct water quality monitoring prescribed by DEP or their local water management district to show that they're meeting state water quality standards. OOP and FDACS is expected to enroll 100% of all agricultural lands within these BMAP areas and verify proper implementation of the BMPs. BMAPs identify areas that need to be enrolled using statewide coverages or watershed and regional level data. These regional plans lack the capacity to review agricultural land use data at a smaller scale, whereas our BMP enrollment data originates at that smaller scale. So that's bringing us to our need to conduct this unenrolled agricultural areas characterization. The land use data that's used in BMAPs most of the time assumes that all 2000 level flux classifications are agriculture. However, within the context of enrollment within the BMP manuals we have adopted by rule, this is not the case. So to determine if something is in fact agriculture and if it's enrollable, we must know certain details like property boundaries, owner and tax information, property usage, etc. Details that are only available at the parcel level and not typically included in land use data sets. Given the workload of identifying and determining enrollment of agricultural lands remaining to be enrolled and the level of detail required, we've developed this GIS process to support our program's planning and policy needs. And before we get into discussing the steps of the unenrolled agricultural lands analysis, we need to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that come up during this process, namely how agriculture is defined and the dynamic nature of agriculture in Florida.
So what is agriculture? One of the biggest challenges with this process is defining agriculture, as agriculture operations vary not just in commodity and size, but how they manage their production. While for some operations, it may be clear that they are agriculture, for others, not so much. As you can see on this slide, on the top, we have pictures of operations that are clearly ag, whereas in the lower row, maybe not so clear. There are several legal definitions for agriculture. There's a general definition, statutory definition, economic definition, and which definition is applied may vary based on the audience or on your location within Florida. When we talk about what remains to be enrolled, the following topics often come up: equestrian communities, inactive operations, urban agriculture, which is becoming more common in the landscape, or rural homesteads that may have some agricultural activity but are only producing food or fiber for their own consumption, or fallow and open lands that may have an ag exemption before they get developed. Next slide, please. The other challenge with agriculture is how fast agriculture can change. Although agriculture is the second largest industry in Florida, agricultural lands throughout most of the state are in constant flux due to the pressure from development in our growing population. Hard-hit industries like citrus are less prevalent, leaving open land in growing areas of the state that is being rapidly developed. Commodity changes can occur quickly due to economic forces, for example, the demand on certain crops, the price of fertilizers, and soil amendments. Open lands that currently exist on county tax rolls are often slated for development in future land use plans, and in the meantime, they may be used for agriculture to gain tax benefits. There is also a lack of statewide land planning that makes these changes hard to track. BMAPs and statewide land use data cannot be updated every year, and each county regulates growth in agriculture differently, and the counties have different priorities. As you can see on the slide, we have some examples of areas that 1 month they were citrus, and then a few months later there's houses on it. Or we have changes in commodity where you have corn and then we go to the pasture. So it's just constantly changing. Next slide, please. As previously mentioned, there are some limitations to statewide land use coverages. So FDACS uses the Florida Statewide Agriculture Irrigation Demand Geodatabase, which we call FSED, to identify agricultural land statewide and within BMAPs, and as a base layer for the unenrolled ag lands analysis. OWAP has a legislative requirement to provide agricultural water use estimates to the water management districts for water supply planning purposes, as the FSED is an econometric model that considers environmental factors such as rainfall, climate data, soils, and economic factors such as price forecasting to estimate projected water use demand. And this database is updated on an annual basis using a variety of data sets via ongoing mapping and ground truthing efforts to refine agricultural lands. Next slide, please. Another base data layer for the unenrolled ag land analysis is OWAP's enrollment coverage. Our office produces a spatial coverage of properties enrolled in our program using parcel level data. And this coverage is used in BMAP documents and metrics, our statewide annual report, and any plans that want to evaluate the status of BMP implementation. And as you can see here, we have an example of a map that we provide for DEP's BMAPs, in this case, the St. Lucie BMAP. And on the left is a summary of the enrollment of agricultural lands by the different commodities that are adopted by rule.
So now, if we're going to go into the steps of the unenrolled ag lands analysis, we'll start with step 1. So the first step that we do is we identify the agricultural areas that are outside of the boundaries of our enrollment coverage. This is done by performing an erase in ArcGIS between the FSED and the latest enrollment to identify the agricultural areas that are outside of that enrollment and therefore unenrolled. And there's an example of that on the screenshot on the slide. You can see that the enrollment is the hatched yellow and the agricultural land use is the green, and any green that does not have the hatched yellow over it is considered unenrolled, and we don't have information about that producer and what they're doing on the landscape. Step 2, we identify unenrolled agricultural areas within Slivers and WMD project areas. So we set aside unenrolled areas located within state-owned properties or properties owned by water management districts. From our program planning perspective, these areas are low priority for enrollment, given that when a producer is entering into a lease agreement with the state of Florida or a water management district, the lease requires that they enroll in our BMP programs and implement the applicable BMPs. We use the Florida State-Owned Lands and Records Information System, abbreviated as FL Slivers, Lands Inventory Tracking System, which is abbreviated as LITS if it comes up again, available on DEP's Geodata Directory to identify properties that are owned, leased, rented, or otherwise occupied by the state or a state agency. To identify water management district restoration or water storage project boundaries, we obtain those directly from the WMDs and their spatial data portals. And at this point in our analysis, we now have the unenrolled ag lands outside of Slivers lands and the WMD projects. For some parts of the state, like in South Florida, this amounts to a really significant number of acres that would not be a priority for enrollment at this time. Our next step involves overlaying the unenrolled ag areas outside Slivers and the WMD projects with property appraiser parcel data. The FSED tells us the type of ag lands and if the land is irrigated and the water use category and other crop information. To know who owns the ag lands and the extent of their property, as well as other relevant information necessary to determine their eligibility for enrollment, we utilize the Florida Department of Revenue's latest statewide property appraiser parcel data. We perform an identity function between the unenrolled agricultural lands from the previous steps and the DOR parcel data. And the output is the unenrolled agricultural lands segmented by the parcel geometry. So the data contains both the agricultural land use information and the parcel information. We do data cleanup during this step, including removing identical parcels. We repair geometry, and we do some dissolves to streamline the data to make it easier to work with in the following steps. We also do more processing that adds in a little bit more detail that we can use to execute some of the final steps of our analysis, such as adding in agricultural tax exemption fields based on the JV value field from the property appraiser data, and adding in DOR land use description fields based on the DOR use codes provided in the DOR data. After we've generated the coverage and done the data cleanup and added the fields that provide the details, we look at the details listed on this slide for each parcel to determine if a parcel is unlikely ag or unlikely enrollable. And the list shown on this slide is how we categorize parcels into eligibility for enrollment and therefore categorize them into their prioritization level. And I'm going to talk about a couple of these over the next couple slides. So in situations where the property appraiser parcel data does not overlap with our unenrolled coverage, this happens sometimes. The lack of overlap is due to the space between parcels, either due to delineation issues or sometimes missing parcels. For instance, if someone is part of law enforcement or another protected class based on Florida's sunshine laws, their parcel information is not made publicly available. So given that enrollment in our program is based on the parcel owner information and the parcel geometry, we cannot pursue enrollment if there's no parcel information available because we don't know where to go or what they're doing. Unenrolled ag lands that fall outside of this parcel data become a low priority for enrollment, except in certain circumstances. Parcels that have a DOR use code of 70 through 98 are associated with industrial or institutional uses, and these can be things such as schools, mines, military lands, churches, utilities, government entities. For instance, the federal government. We don't interface with the federal government a lot of time in our program. And some more examples of these codes are listed on the slide. These parcels are generally not expected to be used for agriculture. And here are some examples of the industrial or institutional entities we can pull out by selecting the parcels that have the DOR use code of 70 through 98. Parcels that have a DOR use code of 99 have a land use description of acreage not zoned agricultural with or without extra features. These parcels are often vacant, and through the responses that we've gathered so far from DEP's mail-out efforts, these parcels have been found not to be utilized for agriculture. So on the slides, you can just see some examples of properties that fell in this use code. They're generally just either, undeveloped open lands that are owned, by an LLC or might be slated for development in the future, or the land use pattern, as you can see in the middle, kind of follows like a wetland or kind of wet pasture type situation where, that could be used for agriculture, but as of right now, all of the data is telling us that it's not. Unenrolled agricultural lands that are within parcels that have a land use designation of timberland they might be agriculture, but they require further review by OOP to determine whether the agricultural activity is enrollable in either a Forestry BMP program or our OOP BMP program, which are two separate programs. To identify parcels that are associated with forestry, we utilize the property appraiser data and select those parcels where the land use description indicates timberland, or in some cases, this designation is based on aerial review.
Parcels owned by industrial or institutional entities do not always have DOR use code 70-98, but we can identify them based on the parcel's owner name. To identify these entities, we perform a summary statistics on the records that do have a DOR use code of 70-98 to get the list of names. We then take the summary statistics output and join it back to the attribute table so that we can identify any matches. Features that match get put into the category shown on the slide. Some examples of these entities that we identify include Anheuser-Busch, Disney, as well as entities engaged in outdoor recreation, mining, sewage, disposal, and these are not expected to be used for agriculture. And here on the slide, you can see that we capture churches, transportation entities, counties, Florida Power and Light, again, more churches and counties, and so you name it, sometimes we catch it. Next slide, please. So one of the most important pieces of this analysis is looking at the combination of the agricultural tax valuation assigned by the county and the land use designated by the property appraiser. And so I just got on mute. I'll just repeat that part again. So one of the most important pieces of this analysis is looking at the combination of the tax valuation and the land use designation from the property appraiser. The just value of the land classified agricultural attribute indicates if a parcel is classified agricultural by the county property appraiser under Florida law. We recognize that the criteria for the parcel to receive this valuation does vary from county to county, and that these valuations, just like any other property information, changes rapidly. So when the data shows that a parcel has neither the agricultural tax valuation nor an agricultural land use, we do not expect that parcel to be used for agriculture. And examples of what we mean by the property appraiser land use not being ag include things such as airports, auto sales, camps, community centers, condominiums, drive-in restaurants, or here, like you can see on the slide, single family properties or vacant residential. Next slide, please. Unenrolled agricultural lands within a parcel that the county property appraiser has not granted an agricultural tax valuation despite having an agricultural land use are also not considered for agriculture. Past analyses show that there are not many of these instances and they have minor acreages. And considering the nature and infrequent occurrence of the combination of these parameters, these parcels are not expected to be used for agriculture. And so what we have on the slide is the list of the agricultural classes from the property appraiser, and then for the different BMAPs for which we provide metrics, we have identified the number of parcels that have one of these agricultural land uses, but do not have an agricultural tax valuation. And as you can see, the numbers are very small. Next slide, please. So if a parcel does have an ag tax classification and the DOR land use description is agricultural, we expect that parcel to have agricultural activity. And here on the left, you have just a short description of the just land value of the attribute. And then on the right, you have those lists of agricultural categories. Next slide, please. So through this process, we often come across slivers, and a parcel that only has a small percentage of its area identified as agriculture is what we call a sliver. These are produced when data sets such as the land use and the parcel boundaries are overlaid, and then due to the small differences in geometry, the resulting spatial boundaries do not align precisely. And from our perspective, slivers are not enrollable because they are an artifact of the geospatial analysis and do not represent lands with active agricultural practices. And for this process, we use an automated selection to capture features where the total agricultural acres is less than 10 or 25% of the total parcel acreage. And here on the slide, we have the agricultural lands in green. We have the enrollment layer in yellow hatching, and then the red highlights where we have identified slivers. Next slide, please. We also perform a lot of aerial review. Features not categorized in the previous steps undergo aerial imagery interpretation. Since there are thousands of records that result from this analysis, we generally focus our aerial imagery review efforts on parcels that contain at least 50 acres or more of agricultural acreage. Any features not reviewed are considered ag since they don't fall into any of the previous categorizations. And here on the slide, we can see that on the right, that sort of pink sort of color is an area that we identified that has clear signs of development. And in the text of the slide, we have general categorizations that sort of come about through the aerial review. For example, when we identify urban areas, we identify how we've noted the feature and then what it actually represents, whether it's a minor utility or rural residential. The same thing for ag. If it's possible ag, we've noted how we've captured it and then what we see on the ground, if it's equine or nursery or other things. Next slide, please. So this table provides an overview of how the parcels are categorized and how they are considered for program planning and policy purposes. There are some categories listed here that we haven't discussed with you today, but we included them because they are part of our larger policy discussions. And in the next few slides, we will show you an example of how this analysis can impact our metrics within the water quality restoration plans. Next slide.
So during the BMAP development process, we provide this data to FDEP when it's applicable to update land use coverages and assist in accurately estimating nutrient loading. Since this analysis is done at least yearly statewide, we also provide this information during annual BMAP update meetings, broken down by each of the categories you see shown on the slide. So this is the same information just presented in two different formats. On the right, you have a graphic, and on the left, a table. Because we're able to keep the parcel information within the results of our analysis, we also provide a count of the unenrolled parcels separated into one of 5 size bins and the acreages associated with each size bin. The results shown on the slide are a typical example. Much of the larger ag acreage highlighted in the bottom 2 rows below the yellow rectangle has already been enrolled in our program, which results in a lower parcel count, where many of the smaller agricultural acreages shown in the red bar and above it have not, resulting in larger parcel counts. And then on the right is a bar graph that you can find in the ag appendix of some of the more updated BMAPs on the DEP website that kind of shows the table on the left in a graphic format. So on the x-axis, we have the distribution of ag acres within each parcel, and then the total ag acres is at the top of each bar. And then on the y-axis, we have the number of parcels. So as you can see in this area, which is the upper Ocklawaha BMAP in Central Florida, we have quite a few parcels that fall between 1 and 25 acres in size to try and, at least analyze to get staff out there to see if they are actually applicable to being enrolled in our program. And this information is also used internally to assist in prioritization of our staff and their resources. And then the end result is a new agricultural acreage that is required to be enrolled in best management practices per Florida law. Originally, this analysis was performed for the 3 South Florida BMAP updates that occurred in early 2020. Those BMAPs are shown in the map. That's the Lake Okeechobee, Caloosahatchee, and St. Lucie BMAPs. And this was done at the request of DEP's Chief Science Officer to identify the count and size and the ag land use type of the parcels that remain to be enrolled. We realized that this information could be used as the basis to create an outreach list to streamline contacting these unenrolled producers and having a way to track their responses to our outreach. So staff performed an additional analysis to assist with mail-out prioritization by adding attributes in the data that identified high-intensity land uses, such as dairies and row crops, proximity to water features using NHD coverages, and the percent and number of irrigated features that are associated with a single parcel. Those three attributes were important to consider because typically when an ag operation has one or all three of those identifying features, it means that it's typically going to be more intensive and something that is a high priority to be enrolled in our program. We then exported the owner names and addresses from the parcel data into Excel and ran a program called Listware to validate or update the owner information so that we can provide a list that our field staff can see with the level of certainty associated with the owner contact information. And this helps explain when we get non-responses to our outreach, and it also helps to explain the workload that is associated with finding more up-to-date information for parcels. So overall, in addition to updating our FSED coverage by removing properties that don't fall under our purview or are being developed or are no longer agriculture, and providing these areas to other agencies for consideration to refine ag land use, water use, and nutrient inputs. Due to this analysis, we're also able to more effectively reach landowners who are likely engaging in agricultural activity. So we can get them enrolled in our program and make sure that they're following the law as written.
This analysis has evolved as we identify data and different methods that can refine the identification of properties that are engaging in agricultural activity. And we wanted to share with you some of the challenges that we have encountered when performing this analysis. Number one, there are thousands of parcels and we are unable to evaluate every single property. There is no simple spatial data process to identify rural residential properties accurately. And currently, the only way to verify if something is rural residential is to talk to the landowner. This process is time consuming. There is no quick and easy way to perform aerial review. And GIS is only a portion of our job duties, so we may be unfamiliar with other avenues due to time or licensing constraints. We don't have control over outside data sets, outside agency or local government rules and policies. For example, there are 67 property appraisers throughout Florida that make different decisions when assigning the agricultural tax exemption and land use information. The DOR parcel data is only updated one time per year, and we do not have the resources to collect and map the data from each county on a more frequent basis, so we are very grateful for the DOR parcel data. And we have attempted to review zoning and future land use data to complement our analysis, but often the information is inconsistent and conflictive. And due to the fast pace of development in Florida, the landscape is, again, frequently changing. We have attempted to improve the process. As I mentioned earlier, we've looked at zoning, future land use, utilities, planning data sets, septic tanks, ERPs, but it's a little complex and the results are often conflicting. And we have explored a potential further automation of the review process by using model builder and programming and other relevant GIS extensions. And as you can see on the slide, this is some of the landscapes that we encountered when doing this analysis. So on the top right, we have a zoning map. On the bottom right, we have an area that was segmented for development back in the 70s, and it never took off, and so it's just vacant land with roads. So it's like, what do you call this? On the bottom left, we have a picture where in the right side we have a citrus grove, and then left we have a development that has just come into what used to be former citrus lands. And that is all we have for today. Thank you very much for your time, and we will be happy to take any questions you have.
If anyone has any questions for the presenters, feel free to drop them in the chat. And I'd like to thank our presenters for the presentation. We have someone just saying it was very interesting and thank you.
Great. Yeah, if anyone has any ideas about this process, we are always looking for ways to improve and then make this more efficient.
Okay, we have a question. What incentives do you provide producers to join your program?
Is the question to for agricultural producers to enroll and implement BMPs? I just wanted to make sure I understand the question. Or do they mean join the Office of Ag Water Policy?
Just for incentives, I can try to unmute you, Becca, if you want me to. Becca, just if you want to clarify a little bit.
Yeah, what incentives do you provide producers to enroll? Because if not everyone's enrolled.
Right, so within basic management action plans, agricultural producers have to do one of the two options that we mentioned on the slide. They either have to enroll in our program and implement applicable BMPs, or they have to do water quality monitoring. Outside of BMAPs, there is no requirement. But we also provide cost share to producers so that they can implement technologies that may not be feasible at the time. So we do have cost share technologies and different monies that we can, if you'd like, follow up with you later on and give you more information.
Okay, thank you.
All right, the next question. Have you considered using GIS artificial intelligence for identifying potential ag land?
I think that's a question that would make Kyle Ferris very happy, but Maddie, feel free to take this question.
I think that so the FSED data set that we went over, we get that provided to us yearly by a consultant called the Balmoral Group. And I believe they do some of that in generating the data. And I think they add new methods and data sets to it every year. For us, that's kind of out of our realm of possibility, just because I don't even think we have software that could do that right now at this level. And kind of like Jasenia alluded to, we have GIS backgrounds, so we do stuff like this as part of our jobs, but we do also have a GIS section within the Office of Ag Water Policy that does more intense analyses. And if something like that were to occur, we'd have to do it in tandem with them.
Yeah, I do know that we've been meeting with the districts for other efforts, and there's a Satellytics company that we just recently had a meeting with that showed us how they're exploring some options to identify agricultural lands. But for the purposes of the analysis that we're doing right now, until it sort of gets vetted at the top level, us using that, we're kind of limited. But absolutely, you know, if the option is available through our program eventually, that's something that could be integrated.
Okay, and the next question, what was the program you used to update the owner info?
It's in Excel, it's an add-on, it's called Listware, or Listware, and I can, we can share with that information. Like, I don't know, Jacob, if you have some sort of forum where people are exchanging information, we're happy to do that. It essentially takes all the addresses and then the output, it runs the tool and then it color codes the owner names and the owner addresses and updates them. Like if like it finds like little spelling things here and there, or like it'll capitalize all of them, or put them all in lowercase. It'll give you a percentage of whether or not they think that this is a real address or a real name. So it's actually pretty cool. And for us, reaching out to people it takes time to identify people. So we want to make sure that we're sending letters or contacting people at addresses that actually exist. So it's really helpful.
Okay, and we have about 5 more minutes for questions. I'm not seeing any new questions right now, but if anyone has any more questions, feel free to keep throwing them in the chat. All right, not seeing any more questions. If anyone wants to reach out to our presenters, their information is on the screen now. We would like to thank everyone for attending the session, as well as our presenters for presenting. We still have one more round of sessions to go after this, and we hope to see all of you there. And at the rest of the conference tomorrow.
Jacob, this is just Anya. If I think the name was Beth, if she wants to follow up with us, we're more than happy to talk with her about the different cost share that may be available to producers within different areas of the state.
It looks like Becca has left the session right now.
Gotcha.
Just after I ask questions, but
Okay.
if anyone else has anything? Oh, another thank you in the chat or questions for the presentation.
Well, thank everyone for their time. We hope you have a great day.
Yeah, thanks everyone.